The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, David Daley on his new book, Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. Plus, Bill Press talks with California Representative Eric Swalwell about what Congress needs to do next to deal with the coronavirus crisis. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Journalist David Daley's 2016 best-selling book, Ratf Ked, opened the nation's eyes to the vast reach of GOP gerrymandering and the GOP plan to lock in control of American politics. Now, he's opening our eyes again, this time with the story of how Americans are fighting back. And we say hello to David Daley, Senior Fellow for Fair Vote and the author of Ratf Ked, the true story behind the secret plan to steal America's democracy, which helped spark the recent drive to reform gerrymandering. And the newest book is Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. David Daley, thanks so much for joining us again on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure. This new book, I guess, could be seen as a sequel to your very last, very successful, titled Ratf, and that's perhaps not the full name, as you might guess. That book was about how partisan gerrymandering is undermining democracy. So why did that book need a sequel?
Well, it's a great question. That book really needed a sequel because Americans wrote it for me in many ways. I would go out and give a lot of talks about partisan gerrymandering, especially after the 2016 election, right? I mean, Americans woke up on November 9th, 2016, and not only was there a new president who had lost the popular vote, but you had Republicans in control of all of Washington, the entirety of Congress, the Supreme Court, almost 70% of state legislatures nationwide. And this is a closely and deeply divided country, and yet you had all of the political power on one side. And I was going around kind of talking about how gerrymandering and voter suppression laws had kind of played a role in creating this kind of deep anti-majoritarianism. And I would often feel like I kind of had a dark rain cloud over my head. I'd go into these rooms of activists who were sort of newly awakened by what had happened in 2016, and maybe I'd feel like I was, sucking all the oxygen out of the room. And I needed to, for my own sake, for the sake of trying to give some inspiration to the people who were so kindly inviting me to, talk to them, I needed to find some optimism. And as I looked around the country, I began to see it in these amazing fights back. A couple of days after the election, a young woman in Michigan named Katie Fahey takes to Facebook and she writes, "I want to do something about partisan gerrymandering in Michigan. If you want to do this too, join me here." And they set up a Google Doc, and thousands of volunteers flocked to this. I mean, Katie gets involved because she was already afraid of Thanksgiving at her house in Michigan. There's Bernie people, there's Hillary people, there's Trump people, right? And she's imagining mashed potatoes and turkey and gravy flying through the air when people get together. And she's like, let's do something about gerrymandering. Let's find something we can all get together on. And it worked and they won, and we can talk more about that later. But there were Katie Fahey's all over the country, and it seemed to me that there was another story here to tell.
I love the fact that you call her the Che Guevara of the gerrymander. Here's a 27-year-old young woman in Michigan. What leads her to take on that role? It wasn't just about Thanksgiving.
Well, I think if you live in Michigan, you really deeply understand how gerrymandering has worked, and how it has warped our politics. Democrats in Michigan have won more votes for the state assembly, 2012, 2014, 2016, 2018. They've never taken control of the chamber, and that's because of the maps that the Republicans drew when they took power in the Tea Party wave in 2010. So Michigan has been living in sort of this anti-majoritarian state for the entire decade, and people are really well aware of it. You could, in many ways, blame gerrymandering for the Flint water crisis. That unaccountable legislature in Michigan passes the emergency manager law that allows the state to step in and take over a city whose finances are in trouble. Voters in Michigan did not like that. They thought it gave the state the ability to kind of, trample roughshod over local communities, destroy union contracts and the like, and they repealed it in 2012. And about 6 weeks later, that gerrymandered, unaccountable legislature that knew it was insulated from the ballot box just put that emergency manager bill right back into place. And a couple of years later, the emergency manager in Flint makes the decision to switch the city's water supply to the Flint River. So, gerrymandering is cheating, and it seems like it's wonky, but gerrymandering also kills. It leads to these extreme policy outcomes. It leads to the, radical abortion bills you see all around the country. It leads to, transgender bathroom bills in North Carolina, things that the citizens aren't thinking about, but these, extreme legislators are. And it creates all of these seats in which there's no competition, no accountability. And so I think Katie and all of the others there, the ground was really, fertile for this kind of a redistricting revolution as soon as it found its Che Guevara.
Yeah. Now, you've got a lot of stories in this book, and one that you tell is that of Desmond Meade. Tell us about him and what makes his story so important.
Desmond Meade is just, another hero, and that was, another one of these stories that just, lit me up. He leads something called the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition. Florida is one of the handful of states in the country that still it takes voting rights away from anybody who has had a felony conviction in the past. Even if that felony conviction was in another state, if you move to Florida, you don't have the right to vote there. And this affected about 1.7 million people in Florida. It's about 10% of all adults in the state, about 25% of all black voters in Florida simply did not have the right to vote. And Desmond's story is just amazing. He's in the Army, and he kind of falls into deep depression and drug addiction after his mom dies, and he gets out, and he's ends up in prison with a weapons charge after just kind of falling on really difficult times. And one day after he is released, He is standing before the train tracks in Miami, and he's determined that he's going to jump in front of the next train. That's how bad the pain has become. And the train simply didn't come that afternoon. So he walks across those tracks. He's wandering for a couple of blocks, and he finds himself in front of a drug treatment center. And instead of committing suicide that afternoon, he walks in, he cleans up his life. He ends up going back to school, finishing his degree. He goes on to law school. He gets his degree. No matter what he does to fix up his life, though, he can't get his right to vote back in Florida. So Desmond Meade joins and leads this rights restoration coalition in Florida. He teams up with a Republican, someone who had been involved in a lobby scandal in Washington, moved to Florida and realized he didn't have his right to vote. And they build this amazing coalition, Republicans and Democrats, white and black. The Koch brothers help fund it, and so does the ACLU. It's, churchgoers, second chance believers, radical criminal justice reformers, Trump deplorables on Harleys, and they build this into such a statewide coalition that they win in 2018. They change Florida's constitution. They give these voting rights back to about 1.4 million people there, and they win with 64% of the vote. So it doesn't end up becoming a partisan thing. It ends up becoming Democrats, Republicans, Independents, all standing up together for fairness.
We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America. Whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We're talking with David Daley about his new book, Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. Coming up next, defeating the myth of voter fraud, plus what we need to do now to protect elections in the middle of a pandemic. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his Common Sense Commentary.
As horrible as the COVID-19 crisis is, it has brought out the best in the American people. The selflessness of frontline nurses and doctors, for example. Yet, it has also amplified one of the worst character flaws in our society, namely the me-first greed of corporate chieftains. Just last August, we were told that a new, more democratic corporate ethic was emerging. The CEOs of 181 big-name giants signed a public pledge that henceforth they would run their corporations not solely to maximize shareholder profits, but also to benefit workers, communities, and other economic stakeholders. Then, only 5 months later, boom, the pandemic hit. Profits dropped, and the new magnanimous spirit of togetherness vanished from these corporate boardrooms. Immediately, masses of their workers were being punted out the door. Health benefits were coldly terminated just when needed most, and the pledge to serve the common good went into the shredder. Well, retorted such pledge signers as Arne Sorensen, CEO of the Marriott Hotel Empire, revenues are drying up, so all promises are negated. In a March video message dispatching most of Marriott's employees, Sorensen cluelessly added this insult to their injury: "I wish you good health and a sense of optimism." A couple of weeks later, workers learned that while Marriott was cutting off their paychecks, it had doled out $160 million in dividends to its rich shareholders, a group that includes Sorensen. This is Jim Hightower saying the CEO did say he'll forego some of his $1 million salary this year, but that's disingenuous, since he also gets some $11 million a year in incentive pay and other compensation. And while workers are now consigned to the unemployment line, Sorensen is in line for a 7% pay hike next year and a multi-million-dollar cash bonus.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, part 2 of our conversation with David Daley about his new book, Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. Dave, there's a chapter in the book titled The Defeat of the Voter Fraud Myth, and a central character is Maine Secretary of State Matthew Dunlap, who served on President Trump's Voter Fraud Commission. Remind us what that commission was supposed to accomplish.
That commission really set out, I believe, to create a national voter ID and to sort of take this, myth of voter fraud and use that to put really new barriers between Americans and the right to vote. And it's led by the vice president and by Chris Kobach, the Secretary of State in Kansas, who has long believed that there's this, big voter fraud problem in the nation, except he's never able to prove it. And there's these kind of really questionable academic studies around this. And in the end, they can't actually produce any evidence of voter fraud. This has been a driving focus of the Republican Party for 35 or 40 years now, talking about all of these votes that are being cast fraudulently, except they can't actually show any of them. There's an amazing study by Justin Levitt, a law professor in California, who looks at every vote that's cast in the country between 2002 and 2014. So you're talking about hundreds of millions, if not billions, of votes, and he finds that there are something like 34 votes, 34 out of all of these, that you could say were intentionally fraudulently cast. So we don't have a voter fraud problem. We have a problem with people suggesting we have a voter fraud problem when their real agenda is putting into place a voter ID system that puts barriers between specific people who they don't want to vote. So Kobach convinces Trump that he would have won the popular vote, that there were, 2.8 million people who had voted for Hillary Clinton fraudulently, and that, a voter fraud is what kept him from a popular vote win. And Trump appoints him and Pence to run this presidential commission. You've got to have some Democrats on a presidential commission. So that they go and they find Matt Dunlap up in Maine, who's the Secretary of State there. Really interesting guy, small state Secretary of State, a hunter. You walk into his office, there's a big bear rug, and, he spent weeks up in a bear stand shooting that thing himself. So I think in some ways, Kobach thought if he's going to have a Democrat on this commission, at least it'll be a small state hunter. Well, it turns out Dunlap was hunting Kobach, and And he relentlessly demanded that this commission actually do its work, that it actually be a presidential commission, so that it be above board, that it be bipartisan. And Kobach had no intention of doing any of that. They were not communicating with the commissioners. They were not even giving them schedules or briefing books on the meetings, and they were trying to keep all of the work they were doing to themselves in a little cabal of conservatives. And Dunlap files suit and wins a series of victories that force out all of these emails from behind the scenes that show what they're up to, that show just how nonsensical their studies are, that show the real intention of this commission. And he calls it the most bizarre thing he's ever seen. And in a matter of days after these court decisions come down, Trump quietly pulls the plug on the entire commission.
Shocker. I mean, that especially with the study that you referenced from, was it 2002 to 2014, and there are, a few handfuls, and I mean, it's absolutely nuts how that was somehow going to be millions in 2 years later. Now, of course, Dave, we would love to talk about every story in your book, but prefer listeners, as I'm sure you would too, to get the book and read it themselves. It's certainly well worth it. But there is one more person we want to ask about, and that's Eric Holder, a tireless opponent of partisan gerrymandering. And one of the conversations you convey in the book is about the impact of gerrymandering on Barack Obama's legislative agenda. What did he tell you?
We had an amazing conversation. I spent a lot of time with the former Attorney General, going across, a number of states as he was working to fight gerrymandering. And we sat down in Ohio and had this conversation. And he told, I asked him if, because Democrats really fell asleep on redistricting in 2010. They weren't aware that the Republicans were kind of up to this scheme to win state legislatures and then redraw all these maps in 2011. And they weren't prepared for the effects of that in 2012. So in 2012, on these new maps, Democrats win 1.4 million more votes for Congress that year, but Republicans keep the House. And, Democrats win more votes in all of these states: North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin. But Republicans keep the chambers. And so Holder tells me that he and Obama are sitting down in the White House a couple weeks after the election, and they're looking at the numbers, and they're trying to make sense of this. And they're like, what happened? And they just couldn't figure out why they had lost chambers in all these states, and kind of what had happened, and that they slowly realized it was gerrymandering, and it was the maps that had changed. And they realized that Obama's second term was really going to change as a result of this, right? Obama probably should have had a Democratic House from 2013 to 2015. Instead, you had this kind of radical conservative House, a House so conservative that, John Boehner wasn't a conservative enough speaker. You had these backbenchers, take down Boehner. You had government shutdowns. You had the 50-something votes to repeal Obamacare. You had the, failure to get any meaningful gun reform through after Sandy Hook. And Obama's second term looks very different as a result of this gerrymandering. And they kind of, figure it out then. It forced Obama to use executive action to get what he wanted done in that second term. And as Holder told me, the trouble with executive action is as soon as you get a president of the other party, it's really easy to undo all of that.
Mm-hmm. And not to mention the amount of flack that he received for every single move that he made in that regard. Holder now leads the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. And you make it clear in the book that Holder will fight just as hard against gerrymandering that benefits Democrats as Republicans. Is that a sentiment you found unusual?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think Holder's general opinion on this is if Democrats have a fair playing field, their ideas will win. And I think that's the right attitude to have. Let's have a fair playing field, and then let's have the party that gets the most votes have the opportunity to lead. And the trouble we have in this country is, right now there's 59 million Americans who live in a state where one or both chambers of the state legislature are controlled by the party that won fewer votes in 2018. All 59 million of those people, by the way, live in states where Democrats got more votes and Republicans still hold the chambers. 59 million is 1 in 5 of us. That's a deeply anti-majoritarian problem. If this was happening in another country, imagine the way our media would cover it, right? It's not politics as usual. It's not a geography. All of this is the result of a really conscious strategy by one political party to change the rules of the system to keep themselves in power with fewer votes. It's deeply anti-majoritarian, and when you consider just how deeply all of this is tied in with race, I don't think it's unfair to look at a situation like South Africa, and say, what you had there was a system in which white South Africans attempted to change the political rules of the country to keep themselves in power, even when they were actually a minority. And that's what Republicans have been doing with these voter suppression laws, with gerrymandering, with voter ID, with precinct closures, with voter roll purges, with specifically cutting down the numbers of early voting days based on the days in which they know that black voters are most likely to vote early. And if we don't stand up and call this what it is and begin the fight back, that the very soul of our democracy is at risk.
Mm-hmm. Well, the remarkable through line in each of the stories you tell is that despite all the failures in American politics today, these people still believe democracy is worth fighting for. Does that surprise you?
It's inspiring. I started this book feeling a little hopeless about the situation and, feeling as if gerrymandering and all these voter suppression laws had really tied our system up into this, double knot of profound unfairness. And I thought it was going to take a long time for us to wash those toxins out of the system. And as I met Katie Fahey and traveled across Michigan, as I met Desmond Meade and traveled across Florida working with them on felon reenfranchisement, as I went to Idaho and drove across Idaho with these amazing millennial reformers who wanted to expand Medicaid there by essentially taking the Obamacare money that was offered back to the states to close the Medicaid gap that their one-party state legislature refused to do 6 years in a row. They bought an RV and they started driving it around at every corner of this big state. And they won. They won a statewide initiative in, a red state, a state as red as Taylor Swift's lipstick, and they managed to expand Medicaid there. As I watched in North Dakota and Utah as Native Americans mounted these furious, desperate attempts to retain their power to vote as, against brutal voter ID bills just targeted at them, against gerrymandering so specific and so unfair, against, officials that ignored court orders. And they fought furiously and bravely for their right to vote. And it's really, really inspiring to watch. Dr. Martin Luther King talked about the moral arc of the universe, about it being long, but that it bends toward justice. And I think it doesn't bend toward justice on its own. It only bends when Katie Fahey and Desmond Meade and all of the hundreds of thousands of people in those states that have voted for change, and you and I and all of our, all of your listeners, put your hand on that arc of justice and pull, because there's folks on the other side who are trying to bend it back the other way. And we can create the kind of country we want, but it's going to take all of us putting our hands on that arc and not letting go after an election win, not letting go after an election loss and feeling down and depressed. We got to leave our hands on it forever and keep pulling it the direction we want this nation to go.
Mm-hmm. And folks like Katie Fahey and Desmond Meade and others that you have spoken with, I mean, they represent the rest of the country. They represent people that might think, oh, I don't know if I can do anything about it. And here, you've got one person who said, all right, I've had enough. Another person who said, I got to get my life together. And, there's success in those stories. Now, yeah, I mean, and that's inspiring, certainly. Now I'm going to turn the corner on you a little bit. I want to talk about another issue that you are speaking out about, and that is the potential impact of the coronavirus epidemic on elections. You wrote in Salon about the impact it's already having in this country and others. What are you seeing that is so alarming?
I think that we're in the middle of a public health crisis right now that has the potential to blossom into a full-blown constitutional crisis and a democracy crisis if we don't work now and sort of use these 200 days that we have left before the November elections to modernize our voting systems so that we can have a presidential election in November. All you have to do is look at states like Ohio and Wisconsin right now, and all of the states that have postponed their primaries, and the chaos and the confusion that's resulted as these officials have been scrambling. If this is a dry run for what could happen in the fall, and we don't know what the coronavirus will look like in the fall, but there's a lot of public health experts who think it could come back for another round, once weather cools off again. So we need to be prepared for this and really planning. We need to recognize that it's going to be really hard to sort of do in-person voting in November. Can you imagine if we're socially distanced and how long lines will be if we're all standing 6 feet away from each other? How long it will take to vote if officials have to go in and, wipe down the machines every single time someone has, cast a ballot or pulled a lever. In Wisconsin right now, officials are scrambling to come up with 1.5 million pens. So everybody doesn't have to use a pen that someone else has used before them. Wisconsin has been unable to get any poll workers in 111 counties. So, in Ohio, you had the governor move to postpone an election the day before the election. And he was right to do that. It would have caused a public health crisis if you'd had people lined up in Ohio back in the middle of March.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Imagine in November if we're postponing or canceling elections the day before in a swing state. We have time to plan now. We have time to expand the vote by mail, to change laws that allow everybody to get an absentee ballot without needing a specific excuse. A pandemic ought to be excuse enough. And to sort of, make the changes that we have to make to laws in states and get ready for this, because voting in a democracy matters. And we've got to have this election. A democracy goes on, pandemic or no pandemic. There are things that we can do to protect the vote. We need our officials to do them. They are so far not doing them sufficiently. You had the Brennan Center, the nonpartisan, the reformers say that we need $2 billion to set all this up. Congress designated $400 million in the last stimulus package. That's just not enough money for this. $2 billion is a rounding error in a $2 trillion economic stimulus package for Wall Street. If we're going to protect the stock market with $2 trillion, let's protect our democracy with $2 billion. It's not asking for that much, and we need to do this now before this gets any closer to November, before this becomes even more of a partisan issue than it is, and while we still have time to do this thoughtfully and carefully.
Mm-hmm. Amen to that. David Daley, Senior Fellow for Fair Vote, author of both Ratf, The True Story Behind the Secret Plan to Steal America's Democracy, and his newest book, Unrigged, How Americans Are Battling Back to Save Democracy. David, as always, we appreciate your time with us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Would love to have you back and talk more about it again soon.
Anytime at all. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. With a president who makes every crisis worse, Bill Press talks with Congressman Eric Swalwell about what Congress has to do to help the nation recover from the coronavirus pandemic.
What's the situation today in the Bay Area in California dealing with the coronavirus epidemic?
We have seen this past week about 50 to 75 new cases each day. And so they're not going up as dramatically as you're seeing all over the country. We have still fewer than 1,000 cases in Alameda County. I think the correlation is that we were the earliest county in the country to shelter in place. We've seen, residents follow those rules, and I think we'll be one of the first ones out of this, and will hopefully be an inspiration to the rest of the country as to what it takes, the discipline you have to show to do this, and then how you can reopen the economy.
What marks do you give Governor Newsom?
A+. And he's only in his second year as governor, but he came in with the wildfire crisis, which I think prepared him well for this. We've seen homelessness go up in the state, and he's tried to address, the moving of resources logistically to help the homeless population. So he was ready for this, and I think he has credibility among Republicans, Democrats, independents in the state.
And of course, other governors have stood up too in other states, both Republican and Democrat. Congressman, how do you assess the leadership that we've seen coming from the governor's offices and some of the mayor's offices with contrast that with the Trump administration?
That's right. Larry Hogan, credit to him and Maryland, Republican governor. There's been a absence of federal leadership. That's unfortunate. I think we've seen in the past both Republican and Democratic presidents bring us together. I was 20 years old as a Capitol Hill intern and still remember that stirring speech of George W. Bush standing on the rubble at the Twin Towers, telling the firefighters, "I can hear you." And he brought the country together. During those moments, President Clinton, of course, after Oklahoma City, the same thing here. I think the president had an opportunity, still has an opportunity to unite the country. But there's a pattern with this president, which is he tends to make every crisis worse. We probably had we probably had a inclination this would happen when you look back at Puerto Rico and throwing paper towels to Puerto Ricans who really needed real relief. And he tends to make things worse when we need him to make it better.
So the latest is the president says he has total authority to decide when the country will open up, when businesses will open up, when restaurants will open up. It's up to him. All 50 states, total authority. Do you buy that?
No, it's a ludicrous statement, but also what I think is going to be embarrassing for him is that he may make this declaration and it's not going to be followed by most Republican and Democratic governors. So what is your authority if it's not even followed and the public doesn't even want to do it? You see industry leaders, people who are responsible for large workforces saying, please don't do this yet until we have universal testing. So it's just, I think the best thing he could do, Bill, is every day tell us where we are, what we need to do in the next week, and what the horizon point is. Give people hope, but this mixed messaging, the thumping of the chest to show he's in charge, that's not helping people who are starting to get antsy at home and are looking for real leadership and a real light at the end of the tunnel on this.
What is your sense of when, either in California or around the nation, things might open up again, and how?
So I talked to our county health officials weekly about this, as well as the governor's office. And even, frankly, Vice President Pence on a conference call that I was on last week, he and Dr. Fauci said that California will probably be out of this the soonest. So what we're looking at is we approach early May when our shelter-in-place order technically should be lifted. It would be a phasing out of the sheltering in place just as we phased into it, meaning that you could see restaurants open at a reduced capacity, that you would have restricted travel into the area, meaning if people are coming from areas that are not yet reducing their cases, they would be screened. They would probably have to self-isolate. And also it'd really only be for essential workers coming into our area. Non-essential workers being able to go back to their offices, but with physical distancing requirements in place and wearing masks. But one business owner told me yesterday in my area, he said, look, I don't want to send my workers back to my workplace until I have the hand sanitizer, all the wipes to wipe down the place around the clock. And there's such a bottleneck, on those supplies that I can't do that right now responsibly. So, and he said rightfully, those materials are going to the hospitals. And so, employers, they're going to do what it takes to make their employees safe. They're not going to do it on an arbitrary timeline tied to the president's reelection, odds.
And would you agree it's going to take some time before people are comfortable, let's say, going to a Giants game, right? Or a Nats game here in Washington, or a concert or whatever, just being back in public gatherings?
Yes, and my wife and I, just like most Americans now, are really maxing out Netflix and other
right.
shows. And any show that we watch now where you see a mass gathering or a crowd, we almost just cringe, like, oh God, that's not proper physical distancing. And then you realize, it was filmed way before. But I think there's just in our psyche now, we are it's going to take a while for us to get back to normal, even if health-wise, I think we can, because we've been conditioned to do this. I don't think it's a bad thing that, we're all probably washing our hands better than we were before. Mm-hmm. We're using hand sanitizer. I think we're, screening passengers from areas that have issues, is probably going to be the new normal. But I can't wait to go watch a Giants game. And I'm sure you're the same with the Nats.
With the Nats, right. So before you left, Congress passed the biggest spending bill in American history, $2 trillion. It looks like, Congressman, a lot of that money has already been spent. I mean, already out the door to businesses. Do we need to do more? And if so, what areas do you think need some more help?
We need more. And first and foremost, it should go to frontline healthcare workers. Look, I understand the economic needs, and I want to do everything I can to make sure that if you're unemployed, your unemployment insurance continues to come in. That if you're an employer using the Paycheck Protection Plan, that you have more weeks than just 8 weeks of payroll, and that we are able to, continue to provide stimulus checks to people who need it the most. But we will be out of this financial crisis sooner if we solve the healthcare crisis first, and recognizing that if we're going to supplement the Paycheck Protection Program like the president is asking us to do, we also need to supplement what the hospitals have. Because I talked to a hospital in my district on Tuesday, and they told me it was a community hospital, smaller, but they said that they'd only tested 34 people. And they said it's not because there's only 34 people who have come to us. It's because we have a limited availability of tests. And so we're really scrutinizing who can be tested. And so I really think testing. Test for the positive or negative result, a test for antibodies once that is available, and then have a vaccine that can hopefully eradicate this. But we need to really fund the science and the health first.
I saw on your website, Congressman, at a recent, I believe, it was a town hall, maybe a virtual town hall, that you spoke about the importance of including mental health, money for mental health counsel at this time too, with a lot of people really frightened and suffering.
I did a town hall yesterday with SEIU workers. These are nurses, janitors, airport workers, in-home support services providers. And they were telling me that, what they're experiencing right now with this, the amount of, sick people they're working with, the death that they've seen, that they need mental health services now, and they're going to need it well into the future. But also, there's no question that this will affect the mental health of the American people, even if you're not on the front lines. I talked last week to a California representative for family therapists. And he was telling me that, we're going to probably find out by the end of the year what the effect this is on the family, on marriages, that, we're going to have unintended or unexpected consequences of this that we're going to have to, confront. And we've always, I think, underfunded mental health services. I know Congressman Mike Thompson, my neighbor to the north in Napa, he has legislation that would increase funding for mental health. And I hope we can take a second look at doing that.
So all of this discussion about what comes next, or the fourth stimulus package, however you want to refer to it, to what extent, Congressman, does that require Congress to come back to Washington? And do you think Congress should come back to Washington? Or is there a way that Congress can either debate or vote like we're doing right now on Zoom?
So ideally, because there's such broad consensus on what is needed, which is to supplement the Paycheck Protection Program, probably extend unemployment, and fund our healthcare workers. Ideally, we could do it the same way we did last time, which would be to, through unanimous consent in both chambers, pass this and reduce the amount of people that have to come back. Now, I've been pushing since 2013 for Congress to have a remote voting and remote committee capability. I've had legislation every term that I've been in trying to do that. And you wouldn't be surprised to hear that it wasn't very popular when I introduced it. And now we have nearly 100 of my colleagues, bipartisan, have in some way or another signed onto the legislation or signed a letter that I've written asking for us to do this. So I think, we have to consider this capability. The Speaker asked the chairman of the Rules Committee, Jim McGovern, to look at how we could convene this way. But I think if the rest of the country is doing this, other parliaments across the world are doing this, we certainly should be ready if that's needed. But I think in the short term, we should be able to get the Republicans and the Senate side to agree. Look, we'll fund the Paycheck Protection Program, but we need to supplement that with funding for our hospitals, and also make sure that this Paycheck Protection loan is going not only to the big banks, but to smaller community banks who reach minority communities and folks, farmers in rural areas.
I'm curious, logistically, how would the vote by online voting work? Would it be on a system like Zoom? And how do you, what's the security necessary? And would you need an act of Congress to make that happen?
So we would have to change the rules. So a majority vote could change the rules in the House. So you would actually, you'd have to convene to do it, unless you could do it again by a voice vote. But I've seen a number of different vendors since I and others have really pushed this conversation forward. Vendors have come forward to me and have presented demos showing how through two-factor authentication they could secure the vote, and that on the other end, the speaker or the person designated to be in the speaker's chair would initiate the proceedings. And it looks like, and when you toggle through it, it's very simple to use, and it looks like you're on the House floor. So it's essentially extending because when you're on the House floor, we take a voting card and put it in a machine, and there's no way to authenticate that I'm the person actually putting the card in the machine. It's just the card is trusted, and you trust that only the person who owns the card is putting it in the machine. So you're just really expanding how far away from the Capitol the person is, because you would use two-factor authentication to log in. There would be, I've seen it has a countdown clock. It has 3 buttons that you would click: green for yes, red for no, and yellow for present, just as you would push on the House floor. And again, I just think in emergencies, it's a capability we want so that we can still function.
And it may not be Congress that makes that decision. Back to the president again. He said yesterday that he's so upset that some of his positions in his administration are not filled, that he might exercise his authority he claims to have to adjourn the Congress, just shut you guys down. All of a sudden,
the president of the United States, Donald Trump, is the biggest supporter of Voice of America. I mean, that is just really hard to fathom that he's going to shut down the Congress so he can get his Voice of America appointee through. He has, as he likes to tell us, and Mitch McConnell likes to tell us, he has put through over 200 persons on the federal bench. Most of the nominees that he has that are not federal judges that are awaiting appointment are being held up because one reason or another, Republicans in the Senate won't allow them to go through. They have a system where any single senator can slow down a nomination. And so right now, I think if the Senate or the House are convening, it should be to address this crisis in front of us, which has completely incapacitated our economy, and people are looking for leadership from the president. And again, I think this is just a way to deflect from his irresponsibility in addressing this crisis.
Do you believe he has that legal authority?
No, he does not, because he would have to have a disagreement between the leader of the Senate and the Speaker of the House over when Congress should adjourn. And under the Senate rules, just what Chuck Schumer could oppose Mitch McConnell wanting to adjourn, and he wouldn't be able to do it. So McConnell would have to change his own rules to then create a disagreement. And Speaker Pelosi could immediately reconvene the Congress if he did that. And she could do it a second later. So again, it's really just semantics from somebody who doesn't want to focus on the crisis at hand.
Bill Press talking with California Congressman Eric Swalwell. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible, David Daley and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.